Today I am reading Bat and the Waiting Game, Chapter 20. Pot Throwing. The sleepover ended at noon the next day, when the last of Janie's friends was picked up by her mother. "See you, Bat," said Frida. "Thank you, Janie. Thank you, Dr. Tam." The first kid to leave had been Israel. His parents had to pick him up early because they were taking a load of Cora's pottery to the farmer's market to sell, which they did every few months, and Israel had to help. It was fun, he had said to Bat before he left, but Bat couldn't tell if that was the truth or not. Bat was still embarrassed about how he had yelled at Israel the night before, but he didn't like to apologize. And anyway, Israel shouldn't have kept pushing him about when they would have to release Thor into the wild. And the next day, a dreary, drizzly sort of day, Israel didn't come to school. "Maybe he is sick," Mom said. "There's a cold going around." She called Israel's house to find out, and sure enough, she found out that Israel had been under the weather. "That's a funny expression," Bat said. His voice felt sort of high and tight. "Because you can't really be under the weather, or over the weather. You can only be in the weather, or out of the weather. Don't you think?" "I think," Mom said, resting one gentle hand on Bat's shoulder, "that maybe you're still upset about fighting with Israel this weekend. Do you want to talk about it?" "I want to know what the weather will be like for the rest of the week," Bat said, rolling up onto the balls of his feet. "You want to know whether the weather will be warm?" Mom said, squeezing Bat's shoulder. "Yes," said Bat, glad that Mom wasn't going to make him talk about Israel. Israel was back in school the next day, but he told Bat he didn't feel well enough to do anything together when they got back to his house. He disappeared into his bedroom, leaving Bat in the kitchen with Tom. "I've got an idea," Tom said. "How about we get our hands dirty?" Bat was not a big fan of dirty hands, but he didn't feel like saying no to Tom. So he followed him out to the back door, across the yard, under a sky draped with gray clouds, and into Cora's shed. Cora was there, wrapping a vase in a thick swaddle of newspaper. "This one is on its way to Vermont," she told them. "I just sold it." "Great," said Tom. Then, want to introduce Bat to the joy of pot throwing? For a minute, Bat imagined the three of them picking up the pots from their shelves and throwing them against the walls, hearing them shatter in his imagination. Cora must have been the concern on his face, because she quickly said, "Throwing a pot is just another way of saying making a pot on the wheel. It's fun, even if it is sort of sticky and slimy. Do you want to try?" Actually, Bat would prefer to go home, or to go to Mom's vet clinic, or even go back in Mr. Grayson's classroom. But he couldn't go any of those places. Not right now. He had to wait. So he sat down at the potter's wheel. "Okay," he said. "Outstanding," said Tom. "First, the clay." "First the clay," Cora repeated, and she brought out a large plastic-wrapped cube of clay from under the counter. She peeled back the plastic and picked up a piece of wire from her wooden handle, attached to each end. She held the wire against the cube and pulled it through, shaving off a layer of clay. She set it aside and rewrapped the cube in plastic. Then she held out the clay to Bat. "Squish it into a ball," she said. "Squeeze it hard to get out all the air bubbles." Baz hesitated, but finally he held out his hand and let Cora place the clay into it. It was cool, almost cold and damp. He folded it in his hands and squeezed, forming a rough ball. His hands turned a dusty gray that dried to white. He squeezed and squeezed. "Great," said Tom. "Now slam it down hard. Just throw it down, right there on the wheel." Bat did. Thwack went the clay against the wheel, flattening out in a satisfying way. "Again," Cora said. So Bat picked up the clay and reformed it into a ball. After he threw it a second time, Tom took a turn throwing and shaping it, and then Cora pronounced it ready. "Okay," said Cora, "throw it one more time. and this time try to aim right for the center of the wheel. Bat threw the clay. Perfect, Cora said. Now Tom will keep the wheel spinning, so you don't have to worry about that. I'll help you keep the clay wet. You just cup your hands around the clay, gently but firmly, like you're holding on to something precious, okay? I'll pretend I'm holding Thor, Bat said. My skunk kit. Great idea, Cora said. Ready? Bat nodded. He cupped his hands around the clay lump. Beside him, Tom stepped gently on the foot pedal, and the wheel began to spin. Cora took a cup of water and poured it in a slow, steady stream over Bat's hands and onto the clay. Good, Cora said. Push the clay down and in, down and in. Don't worry if it squishes through your fingers. That's fine. Wet clay oozed out between each of Bat's fingers, and it was a gooey feeling, but not bad. Kind of interesting, actually. Bat watched the clay spinning in fast little circles. He watched the clay pushing out between his fingers. He felt almost hypnotized by the sensation of the slippery wet clay in his hands. Spinning, the challenge of holding it just right in between his fingers and thumbs. Not too loosely or it would wobble out of control. Not too tightly or the emerging bowl would smush in on the side. But then he could feel the clay beginning to shift off center. It was falling to the side, and he tried to push it back into the center of the wheel. But it seemed like the harder he pushed, the worse it got. And then the clay wasn't a ball anymore. It was a weird, flobby tube, and it was twisting and falling, and then he yelled, "It's breaking!" And flicks of clay splattered his face. Tom took his foot off the pedal, and the wheel slowed and then stopped. You did it, he said, grinning. No, I didn't, Bat said. I made a mess. Mess is the beginning of art, Cora said. She was smiling too. Do you want to try again? Yes, said Bat. Yes, please. Before Bat went home, he peeked his head into Israel's room, hoping to tell Israel about how he had learned to make a bowl, about how it wasn't perfectly symmetrical, but it was still recognizable as a bowl, and how Cora had called it creativity catawambas. Maybe he could even say something to let Israel know that he felt bad about the fight. But Israel was in his bed, his covers pulled up over his chin, his eyes closed. Working with the potter's wheel had made Bat feel so good, and he really wanted to tell Israel all about it. He almost went over to Israel's bed to see if he was really asleep or just resting. And then Tom called, Bat, your mom is here. Bat hesitated, looking at the sweaty curls on Israel's forehead. Then quietly he backed out of Israel's room, feeling sort of lonely and disappointed that he wouldn't be able to say goodbye. And that is the end of Chapter 20 of Bat and the Waiting Game. If you like my channel, you can like and subscribe below. Have a great day.